Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah Rapaner. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. We know you love the content, and so we're here to give you more. Just wanted to let you know, we've got some bonus episodes coming. These are interviews all about the mental load with experts in the field. And I don't just mean me, although of course I'm in there too, but we're working with New America and Haley Swenson there. And we're talking to you all about the mental load. What is it? How do you hold it? How can you solve it? Can tech help you? And what does it look like for women with intersectional identities? The episodes are coming, and yeah, you're going to fall in love with them, obviously. Now let's get into today's topic. I just want to give you a little trigger warning about this episode, about sibling tensions after a parent has died. So we're going to be talking about parents' deaths. If this one is too sensitive or if it's too triggering, skip and go to the next. I'm going to talk to you in this one about research about what happens in terms of sibling tension following a parent's death. These aren't little kids, right? But these are adults who are trying to navigate what many are managing, which is aging parents. One of those parents dies, and how do you kind of negotiate the dynamics around that death and following that death? And what does it mean if you have siblings? The research I'm going to walk you through talks about this and also talks about what does it mean if you are a daughter and your parent has died, or a son and your parent has died. And in particular, what does it look like if you're a daughter and your mother has died? Or you're a son and your mother has died? What does that do for the dynamics between you and your siblings? I'm going to talk to you about an article in Journal of Marriage and Family that's called How Gender Shapes Sibling Tension in Adulthood Following Parent Death. And it's an article written by J. Jill Suter, Megan Gilligan, Destiny Ogle, Robert France, Yifi Yao, Catherine Sepnak, and Sean Baldry. And what this article is interested in doing is looking at what happens in terms of the sibling dynamics, in particular tension between siblings following the death. They talk about research showing that, the death of an immediate family member, or someone you're very close to, is one of the most stressful events you will ever go through in your adult life. It impacts you in a range of ways. It can impact your well-being, your health, your stress levels, your sleep. There's a range in which the mourning process, the death of a loved one or an immediate family member can just unnerve you, unmoor you, and impact your life forever. They're not really talking about that experience. That's been well established, but they're interested in these kind of two key research questions. Do siblings have more tension or less tension after their parents have died? And does it matter if the parents are the mother or the father and if the siblings are women versus men? And in order to ask these questions, they go kind of back to some original sociological research, which is interesting because I think this is not necessarily like a key topic that we look at, but they draw upon early work. So early work by Durkheim, who basically says that the death of someone can either create solidarity. This is Durkheim's argument. It can actually increase people's connection and reduce tension, in part because if you lose that key person, people rally together. So sometimes deaths can be unifying. We have this catalyst moment where we come together to provide support, love, care, and connection to those who have lost someone, and that actually can increase our solidarity with each other, our connection. If you follow this logic in terms of siblings, the idea would be if you lose a parent, siblings can come together and connect, share, love, support each other in a way that perhaps they weren't doing or they were doing, but it gets exacerbated or amplified upon the death of a parent. And so this can actually be a solidifying component. That's one argument. And then they follow Lisa Carsten's theory of socio-emotional selectivity. And this is like, the question is why? So why when we lose someone, does this solidify us? And her argument is that basically when people have these kind of serious events, they start to see their time to achieve goals as limited. They start to shift their values. They start to see that, small things aren't big things. Time is limited. They focus on connection. How do we connect to each other? And they care less about things like, making more money. She calls them instrumental goals, but let's say I'm more likely to say love, care, kindness, and connection is more important than, making a ton of money and having this great life. That sometimes these moments of loss actually shift the way we view the world and the way we view the world towards greater connection as opposed to individual self-interest. And so the argument would be like, actually, the death of a parent is this really critical event where we start to reconnect with our family members. The way we view the world shifts, right? So taking Durkheim and then taking Carsten together is like, okay, so our socio-emotional selectivity, or our theory, that becomes different. We start to see the world different. We start to see each other as greater connections, and that can bind us and make us create more solidarity. And that's one argument. The counter argument draws on these kind of equity theories. And I've written on equity theories around housework, but they're talking about equity theories in terms of how siblings come together when a parent is aging, ailing, or dying. And equity theory is broadly that, like, when things are unequal, people are unhappy. That what we want sometimes is equality, right? That what we're seeking for is balance. And there's this theory basically that says, like, if I get too much, I feel uncomfortable. If I get too little, I feel uncomfortable. And what I always am trying to do is create balance in the dynamic. And so that's just like a side note, right? That sometimes too much of a good thing can make us really uncomfortable, and too much of a bad thing can make us uncomfortable. If we feel like we're getting too much from other people, we get unnerved. If we feel like we're giving too much to other people, we feel unnerved. And so taking this kind of theory of equity, the idea would be is that, like, individuals or people are going to feel hostility and anger if they feel like they're being under-benefited in the relationship, right? And again, that is giving too much. Under-benefited is giving too much than what you're receiving. Over-benefited is giving more than what you're receiving. And basically the argument is that around the issues surrounding the death of a parent as an adult would be one of those kind of catalyst moments in which perceptions of inequity arise. And they talk about the fact that, like, it could be things like, who was the favorite child, who was not the favorite child. And that can create tensions where people are reflecting on their experiences with their parents and creating a sense of, like, hey, I was actually under-benefited and you were the favorite. And in addition to that, not just that reflective point, it can be also the moments of how people step into care around the death of the child. So who's stepping in to do what when the parent is ailing can create this feeling of over-benefiting or under-benefiting. And they're interested in looking at this in terms of sibling dynamics and really around gender. Now, you know exactly where I'm going because this is a podcast around gender research by and large. What they're drawing on is research that talks about this idea that women have been socialized starting in childhood. They call this gender role development. Starting in childhood, and this is a quote, to be especially sensitive to others' emotions and to engage cooperatively with others. Whereas men are socialized towards instrumental goals such as leadership and less towards socio-emotional goals. Basically what they're saying is not only will it matter who's doing what, but it's going to matter based on the gender of the child around the parent's death. And women who are socialized from childhood to be totally in tune with other people's emotions, to work cooperatively, and I'm adding this in, to step into care, will be more likely to step in to help parents as they're transitioning into death. And that will create tension within the family dynamics, especially if there is a son, if there is a brother. I'm already like foreshadowing the research and the findings, so get ready. So what happens if it's just daughters helping their mother transition? What's happening if there's a son in there? And then does it matter if it's the mother or if also the father has died? And the authors talk a lot about how this moment is really critical because it's a moment in which siblings are going to come together to make joint decisions. They're going to be making end of life choices. They're going to be making funeral arrangements, and they're going to be making decisions about the distribution of property and assets or debt, right? Who's going to take it on. And there's this literature that shows that, sons are more likely to have conflict or tension with their other siblings than our daughters. There's other research showing that women are more likely to be collaborative when there's kind of conflict emerging and men are less. And women are more likely to compromise and men are less. There's also research showing that men are more likely to be kind of assertive in when their conflict emerge and be uncooperative. So this isn't necessarily about the death of a parent. I guess the reason why I'm raising these studies is this is literature about how men and women manage interpersonal conflict, with men being less collaborative, less cooperative, less willing to compromise, and more assertive. Women being more collaborative, more willing to compromise, and less assertive in these relationships. And they're bringing this literature to say, during this catalyst moment of a mother's or a father's death, the way in which we're socialized as men and women into gender roles will play a critical role in how we interact with our siblings. I guess I'm raising this because I'm highlighting this for you because I want you to understand that the research is not necessarily about the interpersonal dynamics of siblings. It's more about men and women in conflict. So if you're hearing this and going, oh my God, it's yeah, that's the research. And so that's the way in which socialization impacts how we interact with each other in a range of experiences, of which this study is just highlighting the death of a parent. But you might see that collaborative, conflict, assertive showing up everywhere, showing up in your workplaces, showing up in your marital conflict, showing up in your dynamics with your friends right? So this is not isolated there. They also draw on this research. I just want to say this to you because I think it fits into a lot of what we've talked about before, is that there's gender differences in how men and women also respond to stress, that women are more likely to, quote, tend and befriend others when it's stressful, whereas men are more likely to engage in avoidance or hostility. So again, this is research not around the death of a parent, but just gender dynamics and conflict. And so women are more likely to tend and befriend when faced with stress, and men are more likely either to avoid it or to enter with hostility. They also talk about the fact that, maybe actually losing a mother versus losing a father could be a very different experience because mothers tend to be the primary kin keeper or the peacemaker. And so as these conflicts emerge amongst siblings, if the mother was the one who stepped in to kind of calm things down, to keep things going, to help people reconnect or find common ground, the loss of the mother may intensify the conflict too. So what do they find? They're taking the study that's about the within family differences study. And what they did was the study selected mothers who are 65 to 75 years of age, who had at least 2 living adult children. And then they collect data on the mother and the children. And what they do is they look over time. There's 3 waves of the data. The first comes 2001 and 2003. The next comes 2007 to 2011. And then the final wave that's been collected is 2020 to 2021. And the idea is you're following these mothers who are 65 to 75 years of age. You're following them over time at these 3 time points, and you're interviewing the mothers and their children. The reason why this data is so interesting and allows them to ask these questions is because they can see if the mother dies, right? Some of the mothers will have died in that period of time, in that 20-year period, but they also can get at the sibling tensions because they're interviewing the siblings too. They're surveying them. And what they do is they do some data analysis around the surveys, and then they bring in some qualitative quotes, so they do some interview quotes. And so what do they find? They find that if the mothers died, daughters are more likely to report sibling tensions than the sons. So if the mother has died, daughters are saying, yeah, sibling tensions have gone up more so than the sons. And they're more likely to say that these daughters are more likely to say the sibling tensions are going up if the mother dies than if the father dies. They find that some sons and daughters do say that their relationships become stronger, that the death of a parent does bring them together. That actually it's evident in the research. For some families, that's true. But for more families, or the majority, that's not true. And what happens is the daughters were basically saying that There was supportive relationships with their sisters. Many of the daughters talked about, like, actually the death of my mother led the sisters to come together, and help. They became supportive of each other, but increasing tension with their brothers, in particular surrounding their mother's deaths. The daughters talked about the fact that they were sharing the work, they were sharing the practical work, they were exchanging support for each other in the period surrounding their mother's deaths, but they often described that they were disappointed in their brothers' relationships and the ways in which their brothers were making contributions, and the ways in which their brothers weren't stepping in and cooperating, in the ways in which their brothers weren't working together to make arrangements or settle affairs. And so there was this really strong gender difference that actually, it was tied to mother's passing and then the daughter stepping in to do that work, and then the interpersonal dynamics between the daughters and their brothers. And they basically said that, like, across this, there was this really consistent explanation within families that daughters were coming together, that they and their sisters were coming together and having greater cooperation, greater congruence, and greater tension with their brothers. For the sons, those are the brothers, they had a different perception. They saw that they were becoming closer to their siblings. They reported that they had little conflict in terms of their mothers, in terms of the care, in terms of following death. And they described appreciating their siblings. They were saying, I really appreciate my sister. I know that she did a lot, and she did a lot of work around the mother's deaths. So there's two different narratives coming through. The daughters were saying, no, this is much more complex, and I have very different feelings around my siblings. And the sons were saying, yeah, she did a great job. We reconnected in and we got closer. And the daughters were basically saying, like, yeah, no, it's actually complex. And I'm kind of mad at my brother who didn't step in. I'm mad at the sibling. They were mad or disappointed at the sibling who didn't step in to help. And most often that was the brother. If the father died, like I'm talking about, if the mother dies, what happens to the dynamics between the siblings? And what you can hear from this is, like, if the mother dies, actually what happens is the daughters perceive themselves as stepping in, coming together, congruence to support the mother in that transition, and that they don't see that their brothers are contributing. The brothers, by contrast, see that they are contributing and that they're closer. So people have two very different narratives. If the fathers died recently, there was no changes in the sibling tension. It didn't matter if the mothers were alive or not. It didn't matter if it was sons or daughters. So there's something distinct about the mother dying. When the fathers died recently, like when the father recently passed, what they find is that there was no changes in the sibling tensions. Like, it didn't matter if the mother was alive or not, or if it was the son or the daughter. The gender didn't matter. So for the fathers, this was not the dynamic that played out in the data. But when the mothers died recently, and in particular, if the mothers died and the father had died before, so, right, like the father has died, he's gone, the mother is still alive, and now the mother has died, that's when there was this increase in sibling tension. That's when, they saw, when they did the survey analysis, when they looked at that really the daughters were describing this tension around that. And so really what they're trying to show in this is that actually it's the role of the mother in these families is pretty critical. And upon her passing, the daughters step in to do a lot of this work. I have a study where we looked at, what happens to women's health and well-being when they step in to do this work in countries where there isn't a lot of support, where there is actually this expectation that work is supposed to come into the home and not go to, say, an aged care center or out to the market, right? Like out to have other people step in, but really the family is supposed to do that work. And what I found in that study with Georgiana Bostine, hi Georgie, is that the women who stepped into that care reported worse well-being, that actually it has this incredibly detrimental impact on their health and well-being, on their well-being, to do this care, especially in a context where women are expected to do this care in the home. I think what this study is showing you too is that it really does matter in terms of the sibling dynamics, that daughters are more likely to step in and do this work upon the transition, upon the aging, upon the ailing, upon the health of their mothers, and that their perception is that their brothers are not stepping in, that their brothers are not stepping in the same level, in the same way, and that creates tension between the siblings. The brothers seem to not have that same impression. And it's really, the brother's not saying that. And so the death of the mother is this really critical transition point whereby families can fracture in both their perceptions and in the way in which they step in to help. It doesn't seem to be coming through the death of the father, although of course the death of the father can be equally detrimental and equally stressful, but it seems to be tied to the death of the mother. I think the question is, if we go back to that previous literature about like, how are we socialized to step in with each other? How are we socialized to engage with conflict? How are we socialized to engage with care? You can see some of the roots of this. If men are told that they're not supposed to care, or that their sisters will pick it up, or that women are supposed to step in and do that role, then it makes sense that women step in and do that role. We should get rid of some of that. We should think about the ways in which we normalize men stepping into the care too. If we think about the fact that men deal with conflict or stress or tension in a avoidant or a hostile way, that is not conducive, especially during the highly emotional moment of a transition of parents' death. That having someone who's bringing in that socialized behavior, again, I'm not blaming men, I'm saying socialized behavior into that dynamic is problematic when it's a very emotional moment, and maybe a communal approach is more appropriate. This is a way in thinking about, whoa, okay, am I doing this? How do I explain it? And how do I understand it? Because sometimes your intention is different, but the way you step into the relationship is a result of all the socialization of gender norms, right? Have you ever stepped into something and gone, God, why did I say that? Why did I do that? Why did I behave that way? I didn't want to. It wasn't how I felt. It wasn't how I wanted to act, but somehow I showed up in a way that didn't align with who I am and who I want to be. That is socialization. That is decades and decades and years of learning how to be a man, how to be a woman, how to be a son, how to be a daughter. And that is your socialization process coming into your relationships. If we can get better at understanding when that happens and when we can step into that or drop it and then step in the way in which we want, that's where we're going to have greater harmony. I think a lot of sons are probably pretty sad, upset, distraught, stressed about the passing or the sickness of their mothers. How they step into the relationships with their sisters is critical. Step in a cooperative way, step in a collaborative way, step in a de-escalating way, because they are managing a lot of that stress too, and that can be a real moment of collaboration, coming together, and connection. What do you think about this episode? Let us know. What are your experiences? Does it sit across other dimensions of your life? Share through. You can find me at Misperceived Podcast or at Prof. Leah, or on my LinkedIn if you want to check out all the great things we're doing there. Could you please, if you loved us, if you love this, if you love me, could you please rate, subscribe, and download? It really is actually mattering, and we are so grateful. Again, we're like number 1 in social sciences in Australia. We're moving up the science chart. So what you're doing is really having an impact. And then I get to tell everyone, including my university, how great I am. So if you could do it 20 seconds, I would love you. As per usual, thank you so much for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, you just get to come hang out with me. Just something to note is that we are so lucky and grateful that this series is being supported by the Melbourne Public Humanities Initiative at the University of Melbourne. Thank you for listening to us. Thanks to all your likes, your subscribes, your follows. We are getting some money to support this. Thank you, the Melbourne Public Humanities Initiative. We are so eternally grateful. If you like this episode, if you have comments about this episode, if you hate this episode, tell us. Give us some comments on our Misperceived podcast or at Prof. Leah on Instagram. And also, thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful week. Mwah. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.